Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 4th episode of Sunday Spotlight. With me, fearless founder of ComX, Sizzle, working the buttons for me. And guest comic legend in the Australian scene, Dave Vries. How are you, sir?
Very well, thank you.
This is exciting for me, man. I've been a fan for a long time. It's awesome to get you here, chat, find out your little process, your secrets. I think we're going to get some gems today.
Oh, you're very flattering, but I hope I can give you some something to entertain.
I don't doubt you at all. So, limber up, warm up. We've got some quick fire up questions here, mate.
Mm-hmm.
Favorite color?
I don't know, maybe green.
What are you reading or collecting at the moment?
In comic books or just
Whatever
in
you
general?
like. Comics can be general.
I'm currently focusing on a lot of stuff to do with the South African wine industry. I live in the Barossa Valley, and I was sort of looking at my family history over the Christmas break, and I found out to my surprise that many of the founders of the South African wine industry and many of the wineries were established by ancestors, which I knew nothing about a couple of months ago. So I've been sort of looking into that because I do a show here on the Barossa radio about winemaking.
Well, that's cool.
And I have a little sort of mini vineyard in the backyard where I just sort of play around and so forth. But then suddenly I found myself with a heritage going back over 300 years. So I've become a little bit obsessed with that. So it's a bit of fun.
So it's right in your blood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you a summer or winter man?
I think I like the winter more.
Day or night?
Mainly nights.
Favorite drink?
Oh, gosh, that varies. Depends on how I'm feeling. I guess in social circumstances, probably beer over a meal, probably wine after a meal, maybe some sort of spirit or cocktail. It sort of rather depends. But you do notice the alcohol's pretty solidly all the way through all of that.
So. Favorite or least favorite thing to draw / write?
Oh, I don't really have anything I dislike writing. I guess it rather depends on what the brief is. If it's something where you can inject yourself into it and find something in there that you feel is allowing your voice to come through, it really doesn't matter what the subject matter is. I find I can get into that quite well. I guess the question is, what are the things I like writing more or less? I'm more inclined towards science fiction, action, fantasy, those sorts of areas where you can sort of take a fairly heavy theme and sort of turn it into a metaphor. I really enjoy doing that. So I guess the alternative is things which are sort of slice of life, gritty, heavy realism. I find a little bit. I think it's harder to write because it's much harder to inject yourself into the process if it's something you've never actually done. So there's always somebody out there who will pick up and say, okay, well, you haven't lived this experience, so you don't fully get it. That being said, that can be a lot of fun too, because you can immerse yourself and it's a little bit like an actor immersing themselves in a character. As a writer, I find I can do the same. Art, I just do so little art now, other than I do a lot of color art, but actually generating images from scratch, I just find that difficult because I'm just sort of out of practice with it. Again, I guess it's the type of subject matter that's required. I tend to like subject matter which is figurative, where either human or anthropomorphized characters predominate. Landscapes, still life, stuff like that, I find that a little bit. I've done it. I don't mind it, but it's sort of not really my first love.
That's cool, man. So let's go back a ways. Have you always been a creative person? Were you the kid that was scribbling in a corner in the class, or writing?
Yeah, I probably was. I was. I think a lot of people, when they start drawing, you find if you've got good hand-eye coordination, like if you're an athlete and you've got great hand-eye coordination, you suddenly realize you can do something effortlessly that everybody else struggle with. You're going to be an athlete. You just do. And it's kind of the same with art. You just find that if you can make a mark on a page and it quote unquote looks like something, and you're only like 5 or 6 years old, it's almost magical. And this ability to create worlds which you've never seen or other people have never seen before can be quite a magical experience. I kind of feel a little sorry for kids growing up today, because when I was a kid, most of the images that you see on film now just didn't exist. So I remember I was blown away the first time I saw Jurassic Park, when I suddenly went, oh my God, there is nothing that you can't put on a screen now that that won't look realistic. And at that point I knew that it wasn't surprising actually that the whole idea of comic books and the fantasy element of comics started to disappear not long after, because prior to that there was no computer games that resembled anything approaching reality. Video was in its infancy. Even if you wanted to watch cartoons as a kid, you kind of had to wait until Sunday evening when Disneyland was on, or maybe get up really early in the morning. These days everything's on demand. If you want to get your fill out of comics, if you want to get your fill out of animation, if you want to have computer games, all of these different options allow you to enter any world in any form that you like. There are just so many ways that you can immerse yourself in the sort of virtual reality of fiction. But when I was a kid, really only artists were the people who could create that. So we had a real advantage. I think some of the magic has gone now, and we're even seeing that where people are treating art almost way too casually. We're seeing this sort of what do they call it? Artificial intelligence. Works, which, and to the average hunter, it probably looks fine. It's sterile, but then there's plenty of sterile TV that does well. So I suspect there'll be a market for it. So I think that's something of a shame. So yeah, I guess once I found that I was good at drawing, that almost made me feel like a magician, like somebody who could create these magical worlds. Funny enough, now as a writer, I'm rather encouraged by things like artificial intelligence creativity, because one thing it loses is the soul of the creator, and that's the one thing that the writer ultimately, you can't get rid of that. You can try to get a machine to write a story, but it will never have the same soul that a writer will have. And yes, I know that art won't have the same, but I think sometimes people are a little bit more forgiving of the execution, but the underlying idea is something that either works or it doesn't.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it doesn't have to be pretty, or if you can still find a way to resonate. I think that's the main thing.
If I see a film and I think it's really well written, even if there are some clunky elements in the visualizations or in the acting, I can totally forgive that so easily. And we do it all the time. We go back and look at films from the 50s and the 40s and so forth.
Absolutely.
And Hitchcock's a good example. A lot of his special effects are pretty ordinary and really obvious, but you just walk past that and you go, okay, that's it. I'm in the room. I'm part of this reality, and you just adjust. But the stories, I think, were stronger. I was having this conversation a couple of days ago, actually, that struggling to find films these days that are actually films that I care about, that where I'm excited that I'll go back and watch another one and watch it again. I actually saw a film last night, which was the first time in ages where I've actually gone, oh my God, that was awesome. And it was The Northman. I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't seen it. No, I'll check that out.
Oh, look, I could not recommend it highly enough. It is really, really good. It's sort of, if you've seen, those Viking series and The Last Kingdom and stuff like that, it's sort of playing in that area. Throw in a sort of a Tarantino-esque aesthetic and with a very strong Shakespearean structure, dealing with high themes, but then having that really ruthless brutality. It just ticks so many boxes for me. Every character is fully rounded, and when I say that, even if they are slightly caricature-ish, and they all sort of, like all comic book movies tend to have that quality, it's one of those films where you would, like there are plenty of movies, plenty of series where you can take a character out and just say, oh, look, let's just write him out of the series and it'll be fine. I was watching the Vikings Valhalla series and kind of disappointed that Canute just sort of dropped out of the series halfway through. He was the most interesting character. They just wrote him out for whatever reason. And then when he came back, he didn't really feel his presence was worth bringing him back at all. It was just that. And there a lot of the TV shows, I think, are like that, where characters come and go, and some they ride out, they kill them off, and you don't feel a sense of loss or caring. But the Northman, every single character had an integral part in the story, and I couldn't imagine the story with any of them being removed, and that's kind of rare.
Cool.
There was another one called it was about 3 years ago. I must have seen it a dozen times since. The Death of Stalin. If you ever get a chance to see that, again, that's one I would strongly recommend. It's brilliant. It actually combines politics and psychological thriller, and but also puts you in the mind of what it must have been like to live under Stalin's regime. And it's incredible. And all the characters are fully fleshed out, and there's not a single Russian accent in the entire thing. It's like, because I only found this out while watching it, that apparently in Russia's like, a huge multinational conglomeration, and there were as many accents of Russian as there would be in English. So they would have it to their ear, like we hear Scottish English and Irish English and Australian English and British English and so on. To the Russian ears, it's the same. And so they just said, all right, well, we'll just have lots of people speaking in different accents, because that's what it would have felt like in Russia as well. Really clever.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's you've articulated a few things that I definitely agree with, much better than I ever could have. I definitely agree. I guess, for want of a better word, absence of having whatever you want at your fingertips is better for creativity, as well as having to delay gratification with watching things and finding good movies. And there is a very mass-produced feel to movies these days, with Marvel and Disney owning Star Wars. It does feel, he's just the next one. He's the next one. And it was fun at first, I personally feel. But you're right, it's hard to find those genuinely exciting, unique movies that grip you from beginning to end.
I think also, like many, I had COVID last year, and I had it bad enough that I was sort of bedridden for about a week. And because my wife was in New Zealand at the time, it kind of worked out. So I just thought, right, I'm just taking a week off. And I found my concentration levels were poor.
Yeah.
So, but I thought, okay, well, I've got most of the platforms available at the moment, so I'll start watching some of these films that I haven't seen yet. Or in the case of the Marvel movies, some that I might have seen them in the cinema, but I'll give them a relook.
Yeah.
And I found that there were a number, particularly the more recent ones, where I just started watching them and just got bored and went, oh God, this is terrible. And after about 4 or 5 of them, I thought, is this me? Am I just becoming jaded? And so I actually went back and watched a couple of my more favorite ones, like I love the first Iron Man film. And I like the first Guardians of the Galaxy. In fact, the ones that kind of surprised people at the time. And I went back and watched those, the first Deadpool, all the ones that kind of overperformed. And I could totally get why they overperformed. They were small scale. They knew what they were trying to do. They didn't try to overcook the world, the universe, everything in it.
Yeah, yeah.
And they were just a joy. And I thought, no, it's not me. These films have just become dull. They're becoming incredibly formulaic. I was incredibly disappointed with the second Doctor Strange movie.
I haven't seen that one yet.
When you're dealing with magic, you have to have really strict rules. Otherwise, it's just, okay, how do we get out of this problem? There's a pink unicorn. Or let's bring in the giant eagles. I mean, that was just one big, long giant eagle rescue, through the entire. It was just, seriously. And there was a point where you just kind of, either you like the experience of watching the pretty colors, but I kind of need more than that. I'm sure there are many people who are hating me right now, but I just found it where I really enjoyed the first one, even though it sort of ticked a lot of formula boxes. There was some interesting ideas that it played around with. That idea of time loops was sort of, I've seen it before, but it did it quite well. We saw an element of redemption in the central character, which was good, and it wasn't trying to push an agenda of any particular type. It was just it was exploring philosophy, albeit in a very simplistic manner, and I kind of enjoyed that. I don't know what the hell they're trying to do with the films these days. I honestly sit down, watch them, and I don't know what the themes are that they're exploring.
So you touched on it. You found your concentration levels not so fresh. How do you overcome something like that, or a creative block, or do you feel like you have to go back to the drawing board a bit?
Yeah, I think the why of things is something that I think people often forget. If you're writing a story, I think people overcomplicate stories, and I think that most stories can be stripped down to one simple statement, which is somebody wants something that's difficult to get. That's true for every scene in the film. It's actually true for virtually every line that's delivered. If there is an exposition scene where two characters are talking because if they don't, then we won't understand a scene later on in the film, that's a pretty piss poor scene. But if there is a scene where one character is trying to achieve something and for some reason they were unable to achieve it, and in the course of that this information is revealed, then that can be quite an enthralling scene. So that's important. But as well as somebody needing something that's difficult to get, there is the other question that the audience is always asking is, why should I give a shit? Why should I care? And all too often, we don't care about the characters because, look, there are so many reasons. But I would break it down to this. The term protagonist, hero, and central character are often used interchangeably, but they are actually three very distinct roles, usually in Hollywood combined within the one creature, but not always. And for those who are unfamiliar with this, the protagonist it's a Greek word. It means the first mover. They're the one who makes the decisions. And if a story is not driven by the decisions of a character, if they're just reacting all the time to things, then you have no stake in the journey because you don't know what they're trying to achieve, why they're trying to achieve it. There's also a central character, and this is the character whose eyes we see the story through. This is for one reason why I think Sherlock Holmes works better as a novel or as a series of short stories than as a film. Because in Sherlock Holmes, the central character is Dr. Watson. It's through his eyes that we actually see the journey. And that allows us to marvel at the mystique of Sherlock Holmes. So even though Sherlock Holmes is the protagonist who drives the story forward through his choices, we don't understand those choices, but we know that there's something interesting about it. We can speculate on what those choices are. And if we choose not to, we don't have to worry because Watson's going to do it on our behalf. So those two characters work very well. This is why I think Watson always struggles in dramatized versions of Sherlock Holmes, because the character really doesn't serve a major purpose. And so inevitably, I think in modern time, they will gender flip the character and use it as a something that Sherlock Holmes can bounce off. But the purpose of Watson originally was there to enhance the mystique and the mystery of Sherlock Holmes. In the current incarnations, I find that Watson's role seems to be to demystify Sherlock Holmes, which is sort of the exact opposite of what I believe that character's function is. The third role, the hero, is a hero is somebody who protects and serves. It's a term that's misused so often. If somebody does something and endures, and they go, "Oh, that was so heroic." No, saving your own ass is not being heroic. Saving someone else's ass is. Yeah. Hollywood understands this. When I talk to my uni students, I talk about, have you seen Gone in 50 Seconds? No, it's not Gone. Was it? Gone in 50 Seconds, about the guy has to steal 50 cars. Gone in 60 Seconds, that's right, yeah. So on the superficial basis of that story is that, for those who don't know, Nicolas Cage is a car thief and he has to steal a whole bunch of supercars, and he's got to steal 50 in one night. And yeah, they basically have to nick them all in 50 seconds. And there's lots of really cool muscle car chases, and that's what the story's all about. And if that's all that it was, it'd be an incredibly dull story. But what happens is the story is a little more complex than that. Is that the story is that Nicolas Cage has to come out of retirement. He has been a thief in the past, got away with it, and has been an honourable person who has not stolen cars for something like 10 years. His brother, however, his younger brother, wants to live up to Nicolas Cage's memory. He's got caught by the mob, and the mob have basically are going to kill him unless Nicolas Cage steals these cars overnight. And to make it worse, Nicolas Cage suddenly discovers that not only does he have to steal these cars, but his old antagonist cop from the past is aware that he's got to do this, or has an idea that he's got to do it, and as a result, he is looking to put him back in jail. So Nicolas Cage has to risk his own safety, his own security, his own liberty to assist his brother, and if he doesn't do so, his brother will die. Suddenly that story becomes far more interesting than the guy stealing a bunch of cars because he wants to make a bunch of money. Yeah. It's still the same story with the same excitement and cars and, insane Jerry Bruckheimer style, over the top.
Angelina Jolie in a tank top, all good.
But we care now about the journey because, we can all identify with people, wanting to protect a member of their family. It's exactly the reason why we have anti-heroes rather than villains. So, for example, an anti-hero is simply a hero who just does things, but with a questionable moral basis to it. So, Michael Corleone in The Godfather is the classic case of somebody who was reprehensible and villainous, but he's also an anti-hero because he has to give up being a possible hero, a possible politician, a possible governor, a possible senator, which is what his father always had in mind for him, give up being a righteous man to save his family. And he has to embrace the mafia's code in order to do so. And he does it at his own peril. These are stories which, draw us in. I don't see that anymore in modern writing. All too often characters are acting for very selfish means. They're acting out of fear. There's usually very few stakes. I'm sure you've heard of this idea of people sort of accusing characters of being Mary Sues. And I have to be honest, there's a lot of truth in a lot of those accusations. Characters come out of the box fully formed and without flaws. I find that kind of sad. I know I've been rambling. I do apologize.
No, it's great. That's good. You managed to break down the protagonist and very well. What about, how would you define a creative person? Are there requirements to being a creative person, or what's the most important factor?
Yeah, it's somebody who actually creates. I know that sounds a little bit twee, but it's the truth. If you, for example, want to be a comic book writer, all you have to do is start writing comic books. I know that sounds sort of ridiculous, but nobody says that there's a difference between being a comic book writer and being a professional comic book writer. If you actually make a living out of it, you're a professional. But most people don't start off becoming a professional. When you join the army, they tend not to make you the general. You have to work your way up through the ranks. So there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, I'm going to start writing my own stories. And if there's nobody drawing them for you, well, that shouldn't stop you. Just keep writing. I'm awesome. Philip K. Dick, who's probably one of the most superior writers of intellectual science fiction. He wrote for himself, and very little of the work got published in his lifetime. It was only I don't think he actually was alive when Blade Runner was screened. I think he died during the making of it. I may be wrong, but I was certainly very close. Either just saw it or but he would have had no idea as he was dying that so many of his ideas were going to get turned into movies. So yeah, just do it. And creativity is just having that passion and that desire to do it. And if you're putting it off, then you're probably not a comic book writer. If you're putting it off, then you're probably not a comic book artist. But if you just do it because that's what you love doing, you won't care whether you're making money out of it or not. And the irony is, if you do that, you will eventually make money.
Yeah, there's a big difference between liking the idea of being a comic creator and actually creating it.
Yeah, it actually requires you to put in time.
Sure.
What was the crazy thing they were saying that what most kids aspire to do today is to become a social media influencer, and they would love to do that if they had the opportunity. And I'm thinking, do it.
Yeah.
You can literally just sit in front of your iPhone. How much it cost to buy an iPhone, light and recording device? These days, it's, probably get a package for $100 down at, at one of those, Office Works or something like that.
That's all I
You
got
can
mine.
be streaming by next Thursday.
So do you remember a specific project or just an event where you thought, okay, I've got a knack for this, I want to pursue this?
Yeah, it was literally the Southern Squadron, the first thing I ever did.
Yeah, great.
I'd come out of art college as a painter, and I was actually working on a series of paintings. Interestingly, I was sort of trying to do a Caravaggio version of the various different superhero characters, because most of which most people have never seen or knew about, other than maybe Superman or Batman. So the idea of, creating characters that looked like they were sort of done in a style of an old master, but, with modern iconography was kind of cool. And one of my neighbors, who was the little old lady next door, sort of had noticed this ad in the paper. This is when I was living in suburban Melbourne, for a comic company up in Sydney called Oz Comics, that were looking to do comic books. We didn't have internet back then. If you wanted to phone up Sydney from Melbourne, it was like, I think, about 50 cents a minute, which in today's money would be like $5 a minute. It was just it was crazy. And I literally came up with a few ideas, got in touch with them, wrote a couple of letters, and they said, yeah, we'd like to see what you've got. And so on a whim, I went down to the bus stop in Melbourne, and you could usually, if you showed up at like 9 at night when the bus was just about to leave, you could get a what were they called, standby ticket, and they were like $20, which again in today's money is a couple of hundred, but back then was, it was still the cheapest way to get anywhere. I got on the bus and got up there, met Frank McConaughey and the guys from Oz Comics, and in the meantime, I knew that I had to pitch something to them, so I came up with an idea for a character which was basically the Night Fighter, and then I thought that this character needed a kind of a Robin to its Batman, so Lieutenant Smith was created.
Cool.
And then being on a roll, I thought it'd be kind of fun to do a flying character, and then I sort of loved the Fantastic Four, so I needed a monster as well, and so that was sort of, I had the rough ideas, and I sort of borrowed heavily on the Fantastic Four, so I knew that, like, the Thing has its clobbering time, so I thought it'd better give the Southern Squadron something, so the Night Fighter got to say, hang on to your brain cells. I liked the idea that the Southern Cross could fly, but I wanted to give him something that would cause him to fall, like Thor has to hold onto his hammer. He doesn't anymore, but back then he did. So I thought, okay, he's got a cane, and if he drops it, so then I had to justify that. And so it was sort of kind of trying to come up with a group of 4 characters that were, that each had strengths and weaknesses. I had a mate from Sydney. I was working, so we were always having a bit of a Sydney versus Melbourne rivalry sort of chuck around. So I thought I'd play with that a bit with the characters. I was in the Army Reserves, so I sort of knew about the macho side of life, but I was also at art college, and all of the gender stuff that's going on now is not new. I mean, it's got new names, but
Sure.
just go back to the 70s and David Bowie, and come on, this is nothing new. So I just dropped all of that on the shoulders of the Southern Cross and gave the Night Fighter the most ockerest, the worst case scenario kind of I guess Mick Dundee type of personality, but from the city I could get. I like the idea of male and female characters sort of getting into sexual dynamics. So Lieutenant Smith and the Night Fighter had this curious sexual sort of tension between them. And I needed a character that was older. So the Dingo fell into that. But I also thought, okay, well, I should have a bit of more diversity in this. I've got a young guy and a big guy, but what we don't have is anybody who's a migrant, and in Australia, migration is important. So the Dingo, easily to make him a Serbian werewolf, it was just almost like a pretty easy exercise. So I wasn't sort of trying to be woke, although these days I guess it would have been called that. But back then it was just, no, it wasn't done for political reasons. It was done because it made the stories, it gave me more things to play with, more opportunities and so forth. And because I wasn't doing it for political reasons, I had no problem to make any one of them look foolish or intelligent as the stories demands. So there were times when the Night Fighter, who was probably in today's world, is probably the most reprehensible of them. This was still probably the most popular character. He got to say the things that we all probably shouldn't say, but secretly would wish we had the guts to on occasion. And the other characters the same, and so it was just an opportunity to sort of to play around, and so I really enjoyed that. And I wasn't intending to write, but I needed something to write so I could draw it. So I went up, and the original idea was just to call the series Lieutenant Smith and the Night Fighter, and then over time the Southern Squadron would evolve into that. But Frank said, no, just go straight in with that. And that, without me realizing it, enabled me to have this really rich backstory, which if you're a budding writer, I would always recommend. Write 3 seasons of the TV show and then start with season 3. Skip the first 2. Just keep that as backstory. And you won't believe how many times I've got people who want to work on the Southern Squadron with me, and they'll have a look at the backstory material, and the first thing they want to do is cannibalize it. I'm going, no, that's the gold. Don't you dare touch that. That you eke that out with that is the eyedropper stuff that's a little bit of spice that you throw in from time to time. It will color everything that you do. And people will know that there's this backstory and there's this rich history there. But once you tell everybody that, you've taken away the mystery and the interest of the characters. Right. I don't understand why, for example, Marvel always does an origin story. With every character I would introduce, I would start off with the character already formed. And I'll cite you 2 examples. The recent Batman movie, which I saw recently. They just jump into the story. We don't see the origin of Batman. We just jump straight in with Batman obviously being an existing character. And I thought that was great. And the most recent incarnation of Spider-Man, we never saw his origin either. He's just Spider-Man. We are treated with the respect of knowing enough about the character to know that he's got these powers, and we'll just get into it from there, and that's enough. I don't want to know all the background of the characters. I want to keep a mystery. I want to keep it interesting and suspenseful. So without realizing, I was kind of I'd been given a real advantage by Frank in that he'd set me up to have a really rich sort of series of characters, and then it was just about having fun with them. And because there was all this backstory, it was so easy to pull them all together. And at the end of the first week of drawing, and this is finally I'm landing now on the question you asked. I actually sat down and said, okay, I've got to draw this damn thing now. And after a week, I'd drawn the first episode, not particularly well, but I'd loved every second of it. And then I found myself saying, I could see myself getting up every morning and doing this and going to bed at night and feeling this was how I wanted to live my life.
Awesome.
And at that time in Australia, I don't think anybody was doing that. I thought, all right, well, that's the goal. And there were people like Glenn Lumsden and Gary Challoner and Tad Pietchkowski and so forth who were having that same internal conversation with each other, and we eventually all found each other.
A history in the making.
Mm.
So we talked about how and why. Let's talk about where. What's your ideal creative sanctum? Are we looking at it now? Is it this little room here?
Yeah, well, I'm actually 90% of the room's over there. So I know a lot of people, they put the screen up against the wall and then you can see the room in the background. I'm the opposite. I like to actually look into the room. So I live in the Barossa. I used to live in inner city Sydney, and as I said before, grew up in suburban Melbourne. But I'd been living in the inner city of Melbourne for about 3 to 4 years before I moved up to Sydney. I loved all of that right up until the point when my first son was born, and then at that point, you can't afford to rent in the inner city of Sydney if you want to raise a family. It's just too hard. Just finding childcare is next to impossible.
Yeah.
And I had a look at Adelaide. Glenn was already living in the Barossa, interestingly in a caravan park. So I came down and had a look at it, and I was blown away by the fact that in Adelaide, for half of what I was paying in Sydney, I could live in basically a McMansion in a really posh suburb. People in Sydney and Melbourne have no idea how much money you guys spend, and how much of your disposable income is swallowed up just to survive. And also, Adelaide being a smaller city, the other huge advantage was that even if I commute in and out of Adelaide, the longest I'll ever spend is an hour, and it's usually a very easy, like on the freeway type trip. And because I'm actually out like 100 and something k's from the city, most people in Adelaide spend 20 minutes getting from anywhere to anywhere. So when I was in Melbourne or Sydney, I was stuck in a traffic jam. In Adelaide, they're in the bar. So people say, oh, you make more money in Sydney or Melbourne. Yeah, you do. But your disposable income, i.e. the money you get to keep after all the bills are paid, is less. And it was no surprise that when Glenn and I started being successful in South Australia, there was a time when I think there was something like, it was maybe 15, 18 Australians who actually professionally working for DC and or Marvel and or some other comic company. And all of them were living in South Australia or Queensland or Western Australia, in the smaller cities, because they could afford to do that. Because I remember when I was in Sydney, I could work professionally, but I had to do a lot of jobs as well, like graphic artwork and commercial artwork and so forth, just to be sure of paying the rent. So I actually say to my students here in South Australia, if you have the ability if you need to travel to Melbourne or Sydney to get work, you can actually fly over and back and spend a week there, and the savings of living in South Australia over 1 month will pay for that week in Melbourne. Wow. So you are so much better off financially if you do that. And that's what I actually did. When I first came down here, I thought, okay, I'll accept that I may have to fly to Sydney once a month. And I think in the first 6 months, I went up 3 times, and then I might have gone up once in every 6 months. I haven't been to Sydney in about 5 or 6 years. And of course, now with Zoom and all of the other, facilities, I would strongly recommend if think about your lifestyle, and do you really, really, really need to live in 2 of the most expensive cities on planet Earth? And I'm not exaggerating. Actually, just check the numbers. They are really. My brother lives in Tokyo. It's dearer here than it is in Tokyo now. Used to be the other way around. And your disposable income is is either going to into your landlord's pocket or the bank's, whether you're paying off your house or not. There is a lot to be said for Shane. I'm sure you've got the advantage living in Queensland.
Yeah, Brisbane.
Yeah. And Brisbane's a more expensive city than many, but it's not surprising. Like Glenn and Gary are both in Tasmania, and I don't blame them, but hey, I've got the Barossa, so that's not bad either. But that's the other thing too. I get to come home to here. If I've spent an hour, I'm driving through vineyards, and it's not a stressful drive. And when I finally get home, I've got just wall-to-wall wine bars and pubs and some of the best restaurants in the world. I know this because I've been to Paris and New York and London, and I've been to some of the best restaurants in the world, and many of them are here. And there is a lot to be said for picking your lifestyle and then building your career and your life around it. And that was a bit of an accident. I did originally head for Adelaide, but I never got there. I sort of stopped in the Barossa for a few days with my wife and said, well, hell, you can commute in and out. And that's the thing, in these smaller cities, you can commute in an hour. You can basically travel 150 k's,
Yeah, right.
Well, actually, no, that means you're doing 150 kilometers an hour, but you get the
idea. What about tools of the trade? Are there any you use routinely? Ones you swear by?
No, not really. I mean, when I was drawing, I loved the rotting pens because my hands tend to sweat. And I found that if I used any ink that was water-based, I tended to smudge. And I like that sort of thick, dark shellac look. I used to use Pantone markers for colouring in the days when computer colouring was in its infancy. Now I use, I learned how to colour on Photoshop. There's free versions of that, similar things that are just as good. But I'm comfortable with the interface, so I just stick with it. I tend to, so I like Photoshop. With my writing, I just use Word, really. I don't. I'd love to be able to get a program, and I know they exist, where you could just dictate and then it would sort of print it all out for you. That'd be fun. And I must admit, I like hard copy. Particularly for editing, I can't edit on the screen. I need to print it out, and then the moment I print it out, I can actually then suddenly see the errors. There's something about it being on the screen that makes you think it's probably right. The greatest tool I use is the word check on spell check on Word. I love it. It's I got stubby fingers and I'm constantly screwing up. So I just love to hit the keys hard and pour out my thoughts and not worry about whether or not I'm getting the spelling right, and then solve that in the edit. And so sometimes I read, what the hell was I writing there? It's
I think we all have that.
Yeah. When I used to write, I would write in hand, and then I would actually cut up the strips and then move them around, to get them in the right order. And so I like the cut and paste approach to computer writing. I would have been terrible in the days when you had to write everything out longhand. I would have been a disaster. So I was sort of born in the right era. The computer's fantastic for the type of writing. So when I write, I tend to, because you were sort of talking before about your sort of creative approach, I tend to start off, I guess, with a little bit of stream of consciousness. And as I'm writing, if a new idea comes halfway through another idea, I just abandon that idea straight away. I just hit enter twice and then start the new thought. And then if that enters another one, I'll just double click, and then I'll just keep going down until all of these sort of trails run out, and then I go back a step and then carry that trail back on again that I abandoned because I got this new idea, and I work my way back up to the start again, and then begin again. And if I don't know what I want to write, I will sometimes write little love notes to myself. I'll literally write, I don't know what I'm trying to write. Why am I doing this? And I'll literally write it out. And the physical act of hitting the keys and writing words is enough to often trigger. There is a part of your brain that's actually triggered by physical action.
Sure.
Males and females are a little different. They've done tests on this. The female mind tends to resolve conflict and problems through verbalization. So when women are stressed, they'll tend to talk to each other. They'll talk it out, and that relieves their stress. Males have a very different approach. We tend to internalize. In fact, if you're struggling with a problem and people are asking you, how can I help? That's going to actually stress you out more than actually, and often, and my wife knows just to leave me alone. I'm in my cave. Let me sort it out. And then, but I always, when I have enough of an idea, I'll come out and I'll say, right, I know this is wrong, but now I feel I need to, get in touch with the yin of the yang. So, all right, so this is what I think is got to be working. And I sort of tell her the stuff I think is right. What do you reckon? And then she'll always find the obvious flaws in it straight away. And then I'll get angry, and then I'll realize that she's right. And then so sometimes bouncing ideas does help, but I find usually I have to have 90% of it sifted through. And I notice this with my students at uni, that if they'll always tell you the bits of the idea that they know, and my job is to help them with the bits they don't know. And so I'm one of these annoying people who says, okay, so what do you think about this? And then they'll try and sidestep it and go back to the bit that they're comfortable with it, and I'll just keep picking away at the wound until finally they're forced to answer the question, which they can't answer. And that's fine. Then I say, okay, good. So now we've identified there are 3 areas in this idea that you don't get. So you don't now goose over the stuff you're doing well. You now go and research the stuff you're not sure about. That's incredibly easy to do when you're doing it with someone else. But when it's you, it's really hard to sort of have the ability to step outside yourself. So that's where, bouncing an idea off someone else can be useful. The trouble is if you do it too early in the process, I find they then start to tell you their ideas rather than help you develop your ideas. And there's nothing worse than offering. I never offer advice to a creator unless they seek it out, because inevitably I'll be offering them my solutions to their problems. And then suddenly it's not their story anymore, it's my story.
Makes sense.
That brings us nicely to the last question, I think. Mm-hmm. Over the years, what's the best criticism or encouragement you've ever gotten that really sort of stuck with you?
Yeah, there's been a few. There was a guy at art college called Andrew Sibley, and he had these little pearls that were really just stuck with me. One of them was when we were in first year, we all had uni students think they know bloody everything. You're suddenly free to think the way you want to think. You're suddenly exposed to a whole bunch of things which are new and exciting, and they all seem to make sense to you, and you suddenly think you have the keys to the kingdom and you understand how the world works. The trouble is you don't know what you don't know, but then you take to the streets and you protest and you do all of these lovely things which you feel is the first time this has ever been done. And of course it's been done by every generation ever since, like, we crawled out of the primeval ooze. And as you get older, you start to realize that the world is a lot more nuanced. But curiously, young people who think they're progressive are actually the most conservative human beings alive. They all think the same way as each other. They're very cliquey with each other. They all look the same. They all wear the same clothes. They all have the same attitude. They will. It is quite amusing, but it's kind of cute too, because we've all been through it, and I was exactly like that as well. But it's that humility of being wrong, of being willing to not be sure. That's the really hard thing to do. And I found actually in my life, the most successful times are when I'm the only one in the room who has the balls to ask the most obvious question. I'm sorry, I don't understand what you just said. Can you please explain that? And then everybody's secretly going, oh, yeah, I didn't get it either. But nobody wants to look like a fool. And that's one of the biggest things. So anyway, getting back to Andrew Sibley, that just putting a contextual background to it. What he said was that you should never reject an idea, and particularly, and he was talking primarily about art, but it actually extrapolates out to virtually anything in life. You should never reject any idea until you fully understand what it is that you're rejecting. Don't destroy something until you know what it is. And until you can do, and he said, and once you understand that what that idea is, you won't reject it anymore, because you will now understand it. Most people, we like to other everyone else. Young people like to think that everybody else is othering them, and in doing so, they then other everybody else who's not them. It's really, the irony is incredible. I could say all this because I got kids. They're like in their early 30s now. And I teach at the uni, and I see it, and I totally get where they're coming from, and they keep me fresh as well, because I'm always fearful of sort of getting into traps and so forth. And anytime something comes up which is new and different, and you're convinced that this is the pathway forward, the road to the promised land, and that everything else should be rejected as a result, that is always dangerous, because it means that you are no longer open to the possibility that you might be wrong. And the moment you lose that, I think, because how can you change? How can you improve? If you know everything, then you're a fully worked, fully formed person. People who rate themselves 10 out of 10, and you do hear people doing this, and you go, well, okay, so you're a finished work. Well done, you.
Yeah.
The only human being in history that's ever achieved that, but how magical. So that was one, and that stuck with me like forever. And it's really good for art, but it's also really good for anything creative. So if you see something that you don't get, in politics, for example, people really try to narrow me. They say, "Oh, you're a conservative. Oh, you're a liberal." Yeah, no, I'm neither. I'm not ideologically driven. I have my own personal views, but that's shifting sand. And it's because I don't believe that anybody has a monopoly for the truth. I think that the world is really complicated, and every situation is varied. And no matter how much we think we've got it right, we're going to continue to evolve. And this won't end in 100 years or 1,000 years. This will carry on until the universe is over. We'll always be looking for something new and different. And we'll cycle back, and the universe will, society will go in cycles. And I think artistically, that's really helpful. Couple of other bits of advice. One is that things tend to swing backwards and forwards in a pendulum. So, I mean, in art, it's really easy. You've got the art of the head and the art of the heart, and so everything swings from one direction to another. So it's classic romantic, and you can look at the entire history of world art, and you can actually see that. I was working on a development of a TV show on the fashion industry, and I found that was fascinating because it turns out that people talk about gender these days. The fashion industry's been doing this since day dot. Fashion trends tend to trend from masculine to feminine and back again, and they just a very long swing. That I found really interesting, and when you actually dig into it, it's never as linear as that, because some aspects of it will go feminine and some will go masculine and so on. So these sort of patterns and rules I find have been really, really influential. The other one was kind of on a similar theme. Another one by Andrew Sibley was this idea that he said that every creation is a battle between the artist and the artwork, and if the artist is lucky, the artwork will win. And I like that one a lot. That's where we're sort of touching on this before. If you're writing a character in a film or a story, or if you're an actor and you're actually developing a character, the background to the character to flesh it out. If you allow the character to take you over and take you into places where you wouldn't normally go, that will then open up new possibilities. And it's sort of bordering on the same theme again, because if you think the character should go in this direction, partly in service of the plot and partly because ideologically that's the correct way to go, then you're just a propagandist. You're now not actually exploring the human experience. You've got an idea and you're pushing it. And I think that's probably the greatest weakness I see with storytelling in the modern era, is that there is so clearly strong. I'm trying to think of the right word. Agendas feels wrong. And I'm not talking about left wing or right wing here. I'm talking about this desire to be right. And then using your stories to educate.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's really dangerous, because again, you've got this assumption that you know what you're doing. I was a big fan of the first Star Trek series, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. The foundation of that series was very simply that it was a story about science serving humanity, or humanity serving science. Those are the counter narratives that ran through it. It was basically a bunch of nerds in a souped up vehicle heading through the most amazing world. You can see why the characters in the Big Bang Theory loved those characters, because it was the same idea. It was a bunch of nerd scientists who were off in space pretending that they're superheroes, and that's what you could see the resonance. But what was fascinating was that you had McCoy, who believed that science served humanity, that humanity was central, and that what was all about, and that science, if it wasn't serving humanity, was pointless. Spock believed the exact opposite. He believed that humanity was there to serve science, that the needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few, or the one. In other words, he was Adolf Hitler. And he was totally, and they even designed him to look like a devil. And he had the pointy ears, and he is the most evil character you can imagine when you really drill down to it. And the devil is always charismatic, and so Spock was charismatic as well. Everybody loves Spock, but he is a reprehensible character. If the world was run by people like Spock, and it has been attempted, it would be a disaster. And our whole political system, for example, is based on not the will of the majority. It's to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority, which is the exact opposite of the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. It's quite the opposite. But what is so brilliant about Star Trek is that you've got these two disparate points of view, counter narrative and narrative. Then you've got the everyman in the middle, which is and these days it would be the every person, but it was back in the 60s. We then had the classic male sort of figure that was the leader of the team, and also that he was the stand-in for us. And so Kirk would wrestle with these conundrums. The other two were very certain about their situation, and this is why we sided with Kirk, because he was the one who was in doubt, but would ultimately fall in the right direction. But they then created basically a series of moral conundrums where the characters would go through space and discover different, metaphoric lessons about humanity and about life, and how that worked within the world of science. And of course, we were going through the 60s, during the science age, the space age, the fear of, what is going to happen to humanity as science becomes more and more prevalent. It was a very powerful idea. And I think that's why it lasted far beyond just being a really dodgy, poorly, I know the fans are going to hate me, but hey, the special effects were not great. But intellectually, they were fantastic stories. I still think those stories stand up better than the modern ones, because they were taking us down moral roads. They were getting us to think. And the genius of the writers was they never took a position. They didn't strawman one argument or the other. They allowed Spock to, in fact, be, if anything, the superhero in the story, often putting up the most reprehensible ideas, but in such a charismatic and compelling way that people often went away thinking he was right.
That's really interesting. I'd never considered that.
Yeah, neither.
And that, I think, is what's missing today, is that there is something, that humility of just allowing the ideas to be presented in the most entertaining way possible and letting the chips fall where they may, and trusting that the audience are not a bunch of idiots. I think those are the things which actually make compelling stories. And I fear at the moment, I'm just struck. I miss those days. I want to see more of them. Then it's not like those stories don't exist, but it's harder and harder to find them, because the characters these days are not allowed. Certain characters can never be flawed because of politics. Other characters must be flawed for the same reason. Look, the world will always, cycle round. It's just a phase in the cycle. I think this reminds me of where we were in the late 80s, when films were sort of becoming really sort of formulaic and predictable. And then we suddenly went into the early 90s, and we had that whole movement with guys like Tarantino and that coming in. The artist was allowed to explore different ideas, and Tarantino was, hugely pilloried because he was doing things which were not politically correct. But he created almost a genre in his own right by doing it. And those, if he did another film, I would absolutely go and see it in the cinema, because I know it's going to be
something to look forward to then.
Yeah, because I know it's going to be interesting. Even if I don't like every aspect of it, it's still going to be compelling, And I don't think he's trying to beat a drum. So,
speaking of things to look forward to, have you got anything you want to plug?
We've just brought back the Southern Squadron with the Dark Nebula. That's just come out on Kickstarter. There's a new Kickstarter that's about to start, and I can show you some pages of it. This has been drawn by Ben Sullivan. It's been co-wrote by me and Rob Lyle.
Is this the one you got on the screen?
Yep. So this is we're playing around with little goblins and fairies and so forth. So this is Torn. This is the Dingo. They meet up. I won't spoil the story, but you get the idea.
It'll be good for our viewership if you do, though.
Sorry?
It'll be good for our viewership if you do, though.
Yeah. So it starts off with the characters all sort of meeting up. the usual thing. We're going right back to the early days of Stan and Jack, where the X-Men would meet the Fantastic Four for the first time, think that the others are a bunch of villains, and then get into a big pummling thing, and then team up and track down Namor, or insert the villain of the week, and away we go. So it's not about trying to reinvent the wheel. It's about taking some fun ideas and sort of exploring it. Ben's done a lovely job with the black and white art. I've been colouring it up again, trying not to overcook the colours, just to keep them in. Let Ben's art really do the work, and it's looking good. So this will be coming out in a Kickstarter pretty soon. Actually, I think we're talking about end of January. So, that's like next week. So maybe it's a week or two away, and then it starts.
Cool.
This is part of a 3-part story.
Cool.
And then there's the Southern Squadron and Dark Nebula Southern Squadron crossover. And then there's a Torn and Dark Nebula crossover. So by the time all of these are done, there'll have been 3 stories, each of 3 parts. And so that will then give people a chance to see these characters all interacting with each other. And I think Gary Della is looking to perhaps see these characters sort of all meeting up on an ongoing basis.
Cool.
And Beau Jardine, who did the Nightside and the Rock, he's bringing that Nightside back and the Rock back. I think Lieutenant Smith and the Southern Cross are appearing in some of those stories, so we'll see the characters there. And he's also done a series. It's a 2-parter called the Southern Squadron Dark, and it's basically an alternate reality version of the Southern Squadron where they're dark, evil, mean bastards. And just so people understand how it's all playing out, the reality or the universe of the Southern Squadron is that basically there are these things called mind gates where the way your mind behaves will then resonate with these things called mind gates, and the mind gates will open up various doorways to different dimensions depending on the type of person that you are. So if you're an evil prick, it'll send you to hell, and so on. And if you have strong willpower and focus on a particular reality strongly enough, it can then become a portal to take you where you want to go. So these have been used by different beings, creatures, characters, whatever, for a very long time on Earth. But the Earth has a sort of like an Illuminati group that are kind of keeping this group from coming in. And the sort of the deal they've done is they've said that, look, you can use Australia as the doorway to come in and out because nobody cares what happens in Australia. It's the us end of nowhere. And if Australians see weird-looking people wandering around, they'll just figure they're, wearing fancy costumes anyway. They'll just have another beer and carry on. So, and the idea is that then the outback can be one of the areas where these characters come from. So the Southern Squadron's job is to basically be the gateway guardians to make sure that these clowns, it's a little bit like Men at Black, I guess, the same idea. So, so then they can chase them into these other worlds if they so desire and so forth. And the other advantages, and all the various different comic companies are doing this, so it's nothing particularly original, but it gives me the ability to team my characters up with any characters from any universe or any storyline or whatever, if I so choose. So that's kind of the backstory behind it all. And that way I can even have past versions of Southern Squadron appearing with the modern ones if I want. Beau and I have worked out a steampunk version of them back in Paris in the 1880s, which is going to be a lot of fun.
Awesome.
So these will all start to come out over the next year or two. This year is actually the 40th anniversary of the Southern Squadron.
Wow!
Oh, congratulations!
Which
that's very exciting.
Very, very old.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you for your insightful answers. I think it's really exciting. Shane, is there anything you wanted to plug? The store?
Sorry, the normal plugs I'll do. Yeah, I'll just do the normal plugs. Okay, so we've got this show on Sunday nights. We have the show on Tuesday, the Chinwag. We have the show on Wednesday, the ComX Show. We have Drink and Draw on Friday, and then next week we'll be back with this show on Sunday. So I'll just do that as the plug. And also remember, if you're watching, to like and subscribe to the channel.
And
Drink South African wine.
Yes, please. And you can find me by Peter Wilson on Instagram. And quick shout out to my mum. It's her birthday tomorrow. I'll talk to her then. But she'll love the public shout out. So happy birthday, Mum.
Nice. Happy birthday.
Don't have to worry.
Happy birthday.
And we like to end with a quote here on Sunday Spotlight.
So I'll bring it up.
Thank you, Sis. This is from Jeff Smith of Bone fame. The design process at its best integrates the aspirations of art, science, and culture.
Nice.
And I think we can all take something from that. So thank you, everyone, for watching. Thanks again to Mr. Vries for coming on. And we'll catch all you guys next week. We're talking to NSK.
Yes.
Fantastic.
See you next week, everyone. Thanks for watching.
Everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Right. Thanks, Dave.
This show is sponsored by the ComX Shop.